Okay, so now we're going to continue talking in this page about protecting the brain, and we're going to discuss three different things that help protect the brain. Ventricles, CSF, which is that cerebrospinal fluid which we talked about, and also this thing called the BBB, or blood-brain barrier. We really have to talk about ventricles and CSF together, so we'll do that first, and then we'll talk about the blood-brain barrier. So as it says here, ventricles deep inside the brain are a series of hollowed out chambers. So what that means is that your brain is not all tissue. Inside, you literally have hollow parts of your brain. So, but don't worry, they're not empty. They may be hollowed out, but they're not empty. They're filled with this fluid called cerebrospinal fluid. Let me move to a PowerPoint slide that can show you what these hollowed out regions look like. Okay, just to orient you again, this is the front part of the, actually that's not the image I want to start with. Let me start with this one. We're looking at the side view of the brain, so as if we were coming in from this direction. Here is the front region, here is that back region with the cerebellum to orient you. And show what this blue part is showing is these are showing the parts inside of the brain, deep inside, that are actually hollowed out, okay, and they're filled with fluid. All right, so these hollowed out regions are called ventricles. And so here would be one lateral ventricle, here would be another one on the other side, and then here's a third ventricle, so there's two lateral, which are 1 and 2, and then the third ventricle is number 3, and then down here closer to the cerebellum is going to be a fourth ventricle. Now you may notice what you have is you have little channels that are going to be connecting all of these ventricles to each other. Okay, and so we'll discuss those here briefly. Okay. Actually, let me show you that now. Okay, so here's another view of the brain where we've actually done a sagittal cut, and again we're looking at it from the side. And so this right here is actually a hollowed out portion of the brain. Okay, so the ventricle, and it's surrounded by brain tissue, but this itself is not brain tissue. So this is the lateral ventricle. See that. Then we're going to have a small little pathway from lateral ventricle to third ventricle. That pathway is called the interventricular foramen. And anytime you see the word foramen, you should just know that it means some sort of hole. Okay, we're going to see it a lot with the bone lectures, so just start telling yourself now that a foramen means a hole. Okay. We're going to have another passageway called the cerebral aqueduct, and then that goes into this ventricle, the fourth ventricle. Now here we have this thing called the central canal that actually goes down the entire spinal cord and opens out at the bottom into the subarachnoid space, which goes all the way up here. Okay. Now, I'll talk about that structure in a minute. The other thing I want to let you know is that at the fourth ventricle, you may see this little hole here. There's actually a series of holes that lead from the fourth ventricle directly into the subarachnoid space, so it kind of bypasses this central canal. Okay, and those are going to be called the lateral and median apertures. And so those are just holes that leading from the fourth ventricle to directly to the subarachnoid space. Okay, so that's what those are. All right, so why do all these ventricles need to be connected? Well, this is where it has something to do with cerebrospinal fluid, okay? And what you may notice with this brain is you're going to see these red looking structures here. There's some here right at the wall of the third ventricle. There's others right up here that are at the wall of the fourth ventricle. And then we even have some more here down at the fourth ventricle. This is the lateral ventricle up here, the choroid plexus. These are the structures that produce cerebrospinal fluid. And so let's talk a little bit more about that and what that is. Okay. All right, so this right here, just to orient you on this image, this is the ventricle. All the blue is the ventricle, so this is the hollow part of the brain. Here's the brain tissue, and we have a blood vessel right here coming into it. This entire structure is called the choroid plexus. So this would be a tissue, okay, or you could think of it as part of an organ, right? And lining this part, the choroid plexus, are these cells, okay? And these cells are going to be called the ependymal cells. So here's the name right here, the ependymal cells, okay? And so what happens is that blood will actually pass through these cells in between them, okay, into the ventricle. Now, this is important. It's not everything that's in the blood that can pass through. These things are kind of like a filter. And so they're going to let some things through, but not all of them, okay? And so the fluid that comes out, which is the cerebrospinal fluid, is a little bit different than the fluid that's here in this capillary that actually has blood, okay? And so this, so for example, red blood cells, they're too big. They can't get through the holes. They can't get in between these cells, okay? So it's going to let through some nutrients. It's going to let through some ions, different things like that to help keep the brain healthy and in good condition. Okay. So again, choroid plexus, structure right here found in the wall of each of the ventricles, lined by ependymal cells, and they help filter the blood. So cerebrospinal fluid is essentially filtered blood. Now, if we go here to our notes packets, okay, so the cells that help form cerebrospinal fluid, those are the ependymal cells, okay, but the structure, the larger structure, is going to be the choroid plexus, okay. Remember, we're talking about the difference between cells versus a tissue, okay. Now, the structure where cerebrospinal fluid is reabsorbed, this is that thing that I said I'd come back to, which is called the arachnoid villus. Plural is going to be villi, okay. And these lead into the dural sinus, okay. So let me show you where that is here. We have this slide. We went through all of the different ventricles. And then right here at the top, you see this little structure here. So remind yourself, this is subarachnoid space. In blue, it contains that deoxygenated blood, so that's your dural sinus. And there are these little canals, little structures leading through. And one structure is going to be called an arachnoid villus. Together they're called an arachnoid villi. Okay. So what that means is here is a choroid plexus, and it's going to allow fluid through. It's essentially filtered blood or cerebrospinal fluid. It's going to flow through all of this part of the brain and then back to the blood through that arachnoid villus. So if we go here to our notes packet, the fluid originates from the blood and it is going to be sent back to the blood. So what is the purpose of all this fluid? Okay, well, one thing you can notice, it actually is outside, in between the bone and meninges and the brain tissue, or at least most of the meninges, okay, not the pia mater. And so what that allows this fluid to do is, if you have some sort of impact on your head, it forms a cushion. Okay, so it's going to cushion the brain. Okay, and so we don't want our brain tissue directly hitting onto the bone. We want it to be a little bit cushioned so that impact isn't great. The other thing you may have noticed, you can put something in water and a lot of times it may float. Okay, and so this fluid inside of there kind of does the same thing for the brain, and so it's going to help lighten the brain. And then the last thing, because it is filtered blood, it actually has a lot of nutrients, so it's going to send nutrients to the brain tissue. Okay, and it's also going to help take away wastes. Okay, so all three of these things are going to be a purpose of cerebrospinal fluid. Okay, you may notice in your notes packet that it says here to trace the pathway of the flow of cerebrospinal fluid, beginning with where it first forms and ending with where it's reabsorbed. And so to help you with that, I would suggest that you look at this video here. To orient you, it has all the structures: lateral ventricle, interventricular foramen, third ventricle, cerebral aqueduct, fourth ventricle, central canal, and then here, along here, is going to be that subarachnoid space going into the arachnoid villus, okay, and then the dural sinus. So see if you can trace it, and then I would encourage you to contact your instructor and ask them if you got it right, and get some help if you did not. Okay, the next thing I'd like to move on to is going to be this thing called the blood-brain barrier. Okay, and to describe this, I'd like to go back to this picture here, but instead of looking at this structure on this side, which is the choroid plexus, I'd like to actually move over here to look at the blood-brain barrier. Okay, and another thing that I want to let you know, okay, here we're looking again at a capillary. Here would be where blood would flow through this capillary. Okay, and it turns out capillaries are kind of like a garden hose that has holes in the side. If you put water through a garden hose with some holes in it, well, that water is going to leak out. And so and capillaries are the same way. So, and that's helpful. That's actually what helps deliver nutrients to the tissues, is the fact that capillaries are a little bit leaky. But the brain is so special that we actually want to regulate what gets to the brain tissue a little bit more. And so what you're going to see here in yellow are these things called astrocytes. That's one of the neuroglia that you learned earlier. Okay, and you can see they have these little feet. Okay, and they wrap up that capillary. And here we have feet on the other side from another astrocyte. Okay, and so what I like to think of it as is I like to think of these astrocytes as almost being the like taking duct tape and wrapping it around to plug up the holes. The astrocytes actually help plug up the holes in the capillaries so that they are not as leaky and they do not let things through. This is important. It protects your brain from pathogens, bacteria, viruses trying to get into the tissues. It can protect them from toxic chemicals, protect the brain from toxic chemicals. The problem is as a healthcare worker, you may be wanting to get certain drugs to the brain to help somebody. But you have to remember that these astrocytes, which form that blood-brain barrier, may not let your drugs through or may not let them through easily. And so this is actually something that healthcare workers have to consider when they're treating people with drugs intended to get to the brain, is this blood-brain barrier. Okay, so let's go back here to the note sheets. Okay, and so what is the blood-brain barrier? Okay, it's going to be this barrier between the blood supply and the brain tissue, and it doesn't let everything from the blood into the brain tissue. And these cells are astrocytes that form this barrier. And take a minute, review what I just said You need to about what they do, and see if you can put in your own words how the cells actually form the blood-brain